Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with two guests, Chris Fenton, author of Feeding the Dragon and U.S.-China expert, and journalist John Mac Ghlionn, who has personal experience of living and working in China. They touch on China's soft power approach, its global propaganda arm, such as through innocent-looking means like Hollywood, and what that means going forward. Let's dive in. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks very much for having me, Tiffany. It's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure.
So recently in the headlines a lot is the question of whether or if China will attack Taiwan. But some have been mentioning that if that happens, it's going to be more like a Cold War, less boots on the ground and more in the cybersphere. So what's your take on that?
If you take a step back and look at it, it's clear that the US and China are already engaged in a Cold War, because if you even look at the definition, you know, it's everything short of like open warfare. So it's, you know, heavy on propaganda, and China or to be more specific, the Chinese Communist Party, obviously, and propaganda go hand in hand. And right now, as all viewers are aware, no doubt, tensions have never been higher between China and the US, and propaganda is. This is propaganda warfare.
Well, look, I mean, China has been very good at influencing various parties around the world without a direct conflict of kinetic warfare. We saw it with Hong Kong. I mean, they essentially took over that, one country, two systems territory 27 years early without firing a bullet, unless you count some of the Hong Kong police action as part of that. And you're also seeing the influence that they have on the United States of America or in the Western world when it comes to products and services from businesses that are global trying to get access to the market. They're not using tanks or planes and missiles to get businesses to do what they want them to do. They're simply using the leverage, economic leverage. You talked about information. There's information leverage. In fact, they use Hollywood to promote certain ideals and certain propaganda that they want out there in a very subtle way. The way that they actually pressure whether it's hotel chains or luxury brands not to talk about certain things, whether it's Tibet or Tiananmen Square or the Uyghur Xinjiang issues, the way they're even pressuring the WTO to talk about origins of COVID. You see a lot of very strong, pernicious activity by the Chinese government that it doesn't necessarily utilize any sort of ammunition in the way that we normally think of it.
So what are some of the effects on, say, people's psyche that this could do that people might not realize?
Well, it's very subtle, but part of it has to do with just simply things that the Chinese government doesn't want anybody globally talking about, whether it's Tibet or Tiananmen Square or Taiwan being a separate country, or what's going on in Xinjiang province with the Uyghurs, or any other sort of human rights issues. They are very clear that businesses, whether they want products or services into that massive market, need to adhere to the things that are considered third rail issues. And we saw the NBA walk right into that in October 2019 with the GM of the Houston Rockets showcased his, just in 7 words on Twitter, his support for the Hong Kong protesters. NBA was immediately shut out of that market. And to date, that GM, who is now the president and GM of the Philadelphia 76ers, has caused the Philadelphia 76ers not to even exist in the market of China today because he is involved with that team.
Some have mentioned that the type of information warfare is happening already in America. And so what's your take on that?
Well, I think there's great experts out there, like, for instance, Bill Bishop of Cynicism, who talks about the lack of reciprocity when it comes to information access in China versus the U.S. All the platforms, all the journalistic platforms, all the propaganda platforms in China have access to platforms here in the United States of America, whereas a lot of journalistic platforms here and around the world don't have the same access inside of China itself. So when you look at the information warfare, the fact of the matter is not only are they able to get a proactive sort of spread of information that they want us to digest, whether it's through direct platforms or through social media that's somehow disguised or rebranded, like CCTV was rebranded here as CGTN to essentially disguise the fact that it was a Chinese broadcasting network. You have that direct access, but then you also have what's occurring more subtly and more nefariously, which is this dousing of putting essentially gasoline on any fire that lights here. So there's lots of things that divide the United States of America. And when those divides occur, you can pretty much rest assured that there's the 50-cent army from China that is putting out different messages from different social media platforms to help create a larger and larger wedge between whatever parties are having issues.
And so just last week, the Pentagon's first software chief resigned because he said the U.S. was failing to face these kinds of threats from China, either cyber or AI or machine learning. So what's your take on that?
Essentially, what he is saying and was saying is that wake up, wake up, people. China is testing the water more and more and more, and it's upping its cyber capabilities. This is the deeply worrying thing for me, is that the progress that the CCP seems to be making with its cyber capabilities.
So what's so dangerous about this cybersphere if war is to take place there?
China's quantum capabilities, and they're on the verge, it seems, but clearly you have to take everything that comes out of China with a generous helping of salt, or maybe a few buckets of salt. But it does seem that their capabilities, with quantum computing or even a future quantum internet, if they do succeed in creating this, it will be virtually unhackable. And if they advance their quantum capabilities, you have the potential of maybe hacking into the US power grid and taking down whole cities. They're talking about, we're so fixated on ransomware attacks now that the next big thing is killware, where essentially you tap into water reservoirs, can poison it from distance. This is what we're talking about now. You think of 9/11, and 9/11 was clearly horrible, catastrophic, but the potentials of the possibilities going forward with cyber and the likes of killware could be many, many times worse than 9/11, or 9/11 in different cities across the US. And this is not hyperbole. This is a possibility, a very real one too.
So you mentioned the difference between the U.S. and China, where there's the ability to force people to act a certain way. And you have personal experience of working in China. So what was that like?
It was, how shall I say, it was an interesting experience. I was based around the Nanjing area. My background is psychology, so I was working with athletes who had aspirations of representing China at future Olympic Games. I was working with snowboarders, skateboarders. So I have first-hand experience of dealing with authority figures in China. Somebody would visit our facility and they would have a message from the sporting council. They would come and view our training regimes, inspect the facilities. But you're always under very, very close inspection. You're always being watched. Not just the foreigners there, but everybody was CCTV cameras everywhere. It was a very strange experience.
And while you were there, what are some of the differences you saw between people in China versus free world, say, like the US?
So this is a very important distinction, I think, that needs to be made, and it gets lost. It gets lost in the China-US narrative. That a lot of the vast majority of the Chinese people I worked with were wonderful people, and they treated me very well, really nice. In many ways, they're just victims of a perverse sort of. We're all familiar with the social credit system. They are just prisoners of a really tyrannical sort of environment. and you could sense their fear sometimes if the conversation ever got into like real talk of, so what do you think of, and I did ask this question a few times, so what do you think of the guys up there in Beijing? And then automatically they'll look at you and they'll be like, oh, it's great, everything's great, so I never really got a chance to have a real conversation with these people who were fixated on work. But there was a great degree of like fear. If I was going to say that the overriding emotion there was one of fear and a lot of anxiety, and a lot of people came and went as well. This is one thing I noticed. I would come to work one morning and two trainers were gone. And where are they gone? I don't know. Some of the athletes, they left overnight. Never see them again. And some of these athletes I built up a really like close bond with. Some of these athletes suffered from, I can really go into it, some of these athletes suffered from severe chronic concussions, and they were forced to train when they should be in hospital. We had athletes as young as 12 and 13 chronically fatigued, where they would have to train 6-7 days a week, and I'm talking about 5-6 hours a day, sometimes 9 hours a day, no rest. We had kids who had not seen their families in 18 months, 2 years, no education, very poor hygiene, a lot of kids, a lot of athletes packed into one room, 6 or 7 in a room that should only fit 1-2 people max. The food was very bad, and these were supposedly like being trained to represent the country going forward, but without being too rude, they were treated like circus animals, and it was very sad, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to get out of there, because it's no environment to stay in for too long. You'd lose your mind very quickly.
So speaking of the people up there, some experts have mentioned that the Chinese Communist Party officials make up about 1%, while the Chinese population makes up 99%. And there seems to be a question on why people don't rise up. What's your take on that?
It's very like East Germany, in the 80s, where you would have, so yeah, you're right, the top 1%, but there are a lot of members of the Communist Party spread around the country, and they report back, on their neighbours, and even I think where I was based, there were some members of distant members of the CCP, so they would maybe give reports back, and I think the reason why a lot of people don't rise up is that they don't know who is informing on who, and that. It's all psychological, it's all psychological. This fear and I've written about this as well before, is that we're prisoners of our own making. And to their credit, I don't think that's the right thing to say, but Beijing, they're very good at like keeping people in check, even if there's nobody around. Jeremy Bentham, the philosopher, had a great thing about a panopticon, where there's a light shining down. And it's just, it's a penetrating light. You don't know if there's anybody actually in the tower looking down, but the light is on you. There might be somebody watching you. Then again, there mightn't, but the light is most certainly on you. And I think that's how a lot of Chinese feel, is they feel like they're being monitored, even when they're not. They're not sure. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. But I really do feel sorry for the vast majority of them. They didn't sign up to this, they were born into a system, and I think we're very good at like normalizing even abnormal environments. If enough people are subscribing to it, it can seem normal. All the neighbors seem to think it's okay. So if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me, and it's a bit like the bystander effect as well. Everybody's looking around, maybe going, oh, somebody else will take action, somebody else will do it. But those people are thinking the exact same thing, and nobody does anything.
So I think you mentioned earlier this kind of nationalist pride that's being portrayed in the movies. And some have raised the question of why the Chinese people don't rise up. And some say that the Chinese people don't see themselves as suffering. They kind of buy into this propaganda that they're very well off in the country. So what's your take on that?
Imagine the United States of America if all you had was one source of news, and MSNBC and CNN and Fox News and Epoch Times and OAN and everybody were on the exact same narrative, and that's all you heard all day long. That would essentially create the dissemination of a message that most people would start to believe in and feel like is the truth and something that they need to support. The same thing is happening in China. They don't have the ability of having right-leaning or left-leaning or center-leaning publications and different angles and different points of view and different opinions about the same story. They only hear one version. So as humans, whether they're Chinese or Americans or Argentinians or Germans, that type of information that is played over and over will essentially create the way that you think about things. So the Chinese people are supportive of their government for the most part. And in fact, I'm friends with many Chinese who actually do have the freedoms and the abilities and the resources to actually leave the country, but they actually like living there. It works for them. And if you look at poverty and the amount of people that have been taken into the middle class, whether you believe all the statistics or not, it doesn't matter. There has been a great migration into a middle class. The system they believe is working for them. And then you combine that with a nationalistic pride, one that is maybe anti-American now, or one that is let's reunite Taiwan with the mainland and make us all one like we just did with Hong Kong. This idea that India is saber rattling on the border in the Himalayas, that type of vigor about nationalism and the vigor about the pride of the country is starting to come out. And the narrative that the Chinese Communist Party, through the Ministry of Propaganda, is disseminating through the populace is causing that. And it's making people that were already relatively supportive of their government even more supportive and more proud of the country they live in. And that's a very difficult force to combat from the outside.
So why do you think there is such a strong sense of pride? Because looking at history, the Chinese people have suffered a lot under the Chinese Communist Party. So why do you think there's kind of this disparity?
Well, I think information is very big. So remember, the Chinese Communist Party needs to keep 1.4 billion people just happy enough that they don't revolt. And June 4, 1989 is in the memories of the government. Maybe not in the people, because a lot of people don't even remember it or know about it. But in the government, it's there. And it doesn't take much to create that type of wedge between the people and its government. So they need to create the narrative that they're doing everything the right way for them and compare their nation to other nations in ways that showcase that other nations aren't running their countries well. January 6th is a perfect example. What was happening here in Washington, D.C. was played and broadcast nonstop on the ground in China so that the Chinese people could see, oh, democracy is really dirty and messy and violent. What we have is not. And then on top of it, you have that narrative, that soft power influence over the people. But additionally, they are trying to create resources and the abilities for people to rise from poverty into one where they have all of what they need and some of what they want. So they're trying to create their own industries, which is where we're seeing issues with our own American businesses that have essentially trained the Chinese how to fish rather than just giving them fish. And we're starting to see Hollywood, which used to have an 80% market share in that country, now drop to 10% of a market share because we've done such a good job of training that local industry to cater to their own people. And that can be rinsed and repeated through various other industries, whether it's in aerospace, automotive. In fact, there's articles about Tesla today and all the competition that Tesla now has on the ground in China. We see pop-ups like Starbucks imitators. We've seen Apple have issues over there. It's happening over and over again. And that's mainly because if China had it their way, they could look completely inward and essentially provide all of what their people need under this auspices that their government is the greatest in the world.
So what are ways for people to kind of get rid of this fear, or what can the U.S. and allies do to kind of help?
Desperate people tend to do desperate things, and there are, with China now is we see it with the banking crisis, the housing bubble. There's very high levels of unemployment as well. I think it's up around 15% with the younger generation. Maybe if things get desperate enough, there might be some sort of revolt, but there has to be some sort of responsibility, I think, for the US and the EU. But if the EU was maybe more together, and the US and the EU were kind of, singing from the same hymn sheet, if you will, they could take stronger action. But I really think a lot of countries are compromised. They rely too heavily. We've created, and by we I mean our governments have largely created the mess we find ourselves in. We're beholden to China now. So what are you going to do? Hey, Xi Jinping, CCP, stop mistreating your people. We're too reliant on China for X, Y, and Z. We can't say that. But we see it with the Biden administration, who have released like a harshly worded statement, which is laughable in itself, because we're dealing with a dictatorship, and it's going to take more than a harshly worded statement. We saw with the Microsoft hack, essentially it was like, hey, we know what you did, now please don't do that again, or else. But Beijing knows or else. They're like, or else what? Nothing will happen. Sadly, I think that's the mindset that really prevails in Beijing. It's a lot of hot air coming from Washington, coming from the EU. We only see it with smaller countries like Lithuania, for God's sake. Like, no disrespect to Lithuania, but Lithuania is one of the few countries that stood up to China. But it's going to take more than Lithuania. Again, no disrespect to the Lithuanians, but it's going to take a lot of more substantial countries to stand up to China if we're going to see any sort of progress. And sadly, again, I don't think that's going to occur. I really don't. I think we all need to keep in mind when we're talking about China, we need to separate the CCP from China, because this is where like xenophobia and racism gets injected into the narrative, and we need to bear in mind that the vast majority of Chinese people are victims of a really, really horrible system that I've seen firsthand, where people are worked 9, 10, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, no holidays, very little time off, underpaid, overworked, vast majority are exhausted, psychologically, physically. We need to bear that in mind, that it's, as you said, it's a small percentage in Beijing that are like inflicting this pain. And I can't emphasize that enough, that we need to really separate the two, and remember that the vast majority of Chinese people they need our help, and I don't know what our help even means, but they need some sort of assistance, and I don't know where that's going to come from.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
I love being on, and once again, I'm very hopeful about this, but this is something that the United States of America and our Western allies need to unite on to approach correctly and successfully.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
And for those just tuning in, that was today's special episode with guests John Mac Ghlionn and Chris Fenton. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.